Okay, welcome back. It is 9/6 of 2015. Having just completed our look at Aquinas and the doctrine of the soul, we need to look at his source material, and his source material was Aristotle on the soul. And we're going to look at the original manuscript by Aristotle. We're going to look at a 1936 English translation by W.S. Hett. Published by Harvard University Press. And we're going to get to a preliminary look at the structure, and then we'll move from there as we get further into Aristotle's work. Because initially Aristotle gives a very brief outline, more or less just an outline of the soul and its three moments, its three primary modalities. It's three functional modalities of sensation, cognition, and movement. And those are the three moments we want to look at to get the general outline of the soul. And then we'll move on to more detailed work later on. If you take a look at our flow chart, you're going to notice that we're going to begin with the sentient soul, or the imagination. And sensations are received as discernment and as imaging in the sentient soul. And the sentient soul discerns differences as a ratio of extremes. So the extreme qualities that are, or the extreme attributes that are present in a sensation, in an object that's being considered, those two extremes are weighed against each other, and we form our sensation as a mediation point, a ratio of those two extremes. So it's always a sensation somewhere in the middle between the two extremes of the object and its attributes. And then we form a percept, or a sensible psychical object of being, out of that sensation. We do form a sort of a transformation. We transform sensation into percept, which is a psychical object, a percept. And perception in sensation is always true of its proper object. And Aristotle says we do form an emotional judgment here, which simply means that we either affirm it as something we want to pursue, or we consider it something to be avoided in the future. So it's basically just an affirmation or negation. We do end up with a lexical network of sensible percepts stored within this sentient soul. So we do end up with lexical content, but it's going to be simply a lexical content of sensible percepts. But the overall soul for Aristotle will include nutrition, or appetite, sensation, thought, and movement. And B, C, and D are what we're going to concentrate on here: sensation, thought, and movement. The soul is the first principle of the body. It is the form of the body. It is also the final cause, or the intentionality of the body. But the sentient soul defines the self's body state. The sentient soul defines the self's emotive or emotional body state, and any change in the emotional body state. But Aristotle says sensation is always that which takes place with a self that's already involved in a dialectic of exercising knowledge. We're already in the process of doing cognitive work. Anytime we do receive a sensation, we are individuals always involved in cognitive work, according to Aristotle. But sensation is always about particulars and grasping particular percepts, whereas knowledge is going to grasp universal signs or universal concepts. So the sentient soul will grasp and form the lexical content of particular percepts. And they are a transformation of sensation to percept, which sheds the matter and grasps the form without matter as a percept. So we do have some preliminary rational work being done in the sentient soul, because we are cognitive beings, according to Aristotle, even in the realm of the sentient soul, and receiving percepts we're still cognizing beings all the time. We're always involved in exercising knowledge. And we will grasp these sensations as psychical percepts, and we will form a lexical network of psychical percepts, and then we'll transfer them into the realm of the possible intellect. So if we take a look at the possible intellect, Aristotle starts out with three fundamental axioms. Mind possesses a capacity to receive a form of an object. The mind is capable of thinking in itself. That's important. It's not dependent on some external force. Mind is capable of thinking in itself, and mind possesses forms and potentiality. It doesn't have a pre-existing realm of forms that it possesses, in, say, the way that Plato spoke. For Aristotle, the forms exist as a potentiality within the soul. They don't pre-exist. Now, for Aristotle, there is an agent intellect, just as Aquinas had noted, of potential knowledge and a possible intellect of actual knowledge. Now, the sensible percepts are transferred here in the possible intellect and become intelligible images for Aristotle. They get transformed in being transferred in, they get transformed from percepts to intelligible images. So there's a transformation that takes place immediately, and then the intellect is that which will eventually excite the body toward movement, toward some kind of an eschatological movement. And for Aristotle, there are four kinds of movement. There can be a change of position, an actual change of position in space. There can be a change of state of mind. There can be decay. There can be growth. So, number one points to a change at the level of body. Number two points to a level of change at the level of mind. There can also be a decay and growth. But the movement of the mind is thinking for Aristotle. The mind is independent substance. It's not dependent on something outside itself. And it is the form of the body. It is the directional form of the body. Now, he uses the metaphor of sleep and waking. Sleep is our latent possession of knowledge. Waking is when we exercise that knowledge in positing the eschatological trajectory of movement. So he does use the metaphors of sleep and waking with reference to knowledge. But we have these lexical content of percepts that we've gained in sensation. Then we have a transformation of those percepts into intelligible images that can be worked on in a deeper way in order to grasp the universal signs. Rather than simply leaving them at the level of particulars, we want to move toward universality. And that's key for Aristotle because it's out of the possible intellect that we're going to posit our positing for movement. And so let's take a look. We're going to skip the third moment of the Kunta threshold because Aristotle hasn't gotten into that yet in the original document. He will, but he hasn't discussed that yet. He's just getting the basic structure down right now. So we're going to move to the Roman numeral 4 of looking at the positing toward movement. We've looked at sensation, cognition, and now we're going to look at movement. And it's the practical modality of movement as practical mind and appetite. So you've got two elements of action here, practical mind and appetite. For Aristotle, the possible intellect always remains still and holds the universal and the ideal sign model, but when possible intellect is posited, it becomes individual, practical, and focused on a practical eschatological end. And just so you'll understand, for Aristotle, he says the huge difference between the speculative intellect and the practical intellect is that the practical intellect emphasizes an eschatological end. It individualizes an eschatological end. Now, note 3, the actual mover for movement is appetite, and appetite is broken down into two parts, will and desire. And this is key for Aristotle because appetite is going to be appetite's going to be the driving force of our movement in historical reality, but it has an ideal side and it has a sensate side. The ideal side is going to be the will that's informed by thought. The sensate side that can be contaminated is going to be the side of desire. Now, note 4 gives us our breakdown, the 5-step process of positing. The speculative intellect posits its praxis-based practical mind. Practical mind then encodes and imprints the appetite of the will. The will is informed by mind. It is informed by thinking. Then the appetite of the will as the mind side is coupled with the appetite of desire as the body side, and the synthesis of the two in appetite provides the inertia for the actual action of existence in order to realize the practical good. So then appetite goes out of itself in action and return. But because appetite is two-sided, the practical good can become contaminated because appetite of thoughtful will is eschatologically projected, but appetite of desire for Aristotle is always directed toward the present and the sensate. Now, speculative mind and practical mind are spatially inseparable. I mean, it's two sides of the same thing for Aristotle, but they are distinct in the notion of positing. One remains the at-still universality, and the other is the posited individuality. So they're distinct in the act of positing, but they are spatially inseparable within mind. Now, one interesting metaphor, Aristotle describes the realm of positing as a ball and socket joint joined together to produce movement. So it's a singular joint of two portions, two parts, the ball and the socket, and in order to produce movement. So that you got the ideal universality, which remains stationary, and then you've got the positing as an individual articulation of that universality as how we see the practical good moving forward in historical reality. Ball and socket joint joined together to produce movement. That's the metaphor. But it's interesting to see that for Aristotle, we're looking at appetite as the driving inertia. And that way we can understand that it's not just actualization that becomes the possibility for contamination, but the positing in reality itself, the act itself, can become contaminated if we let sensate desire override the ideality in the thought-driven will. We need the mind to take priority, and the mind and the thoughtful will take priority over the sensate desire. So those two are in a battle within the subject. And then we've got, in objective reality, we've got the ideal that's trying to emerge that's also in tension against the sensate reality. So you got a subjective tension and an objective tension that will create a diversity of feedback and return. But fundamentally, what we get in Aristotle's first treatment on the soul, and it is the first major work that we're going to look at, he really makes it a general triad outline. He doesn't really want to get into elaborating on a lot of detail, like community and the Da Kunta threshold. He leaves that blank for now. He just wants to emphasize for his readers, here's my snapshot picture of the soul as sensation, cognition, and movement. Sensation, cognition, and movement. Just keep that triad as reciprocally related to each other, and you'll understand my outline of the soul as sensation, cognition, and movement. And you have to really understand his 5-point positing and how positing is involved in a tension between the sensate and the ideal on the subjective side and on the objective side. So it's a great treatment, and we can really understand now how Aquinas acquired his position, because Aquinas really did align himself perfectly with Aristotle. But what I see here is that we get quite a bit more attention given to appetite by Aristotle that Aquinas didn't necessarily address. I think we have a little bit more detail in the realm of positing with Aristotle than we found in Aquinas. So I think he gives us more attention to the practical modality of movement than did Aquinas. Now later, of course, Franz Brentano picked up Aquinas and Aristotle, and he gave a tremendous amount of attention to the realm of positing, to the realm of inexistence. Franz Brentano dealt heavily with that Roman numeral 4, so he returned a little bit more toward the original document of Aristotle and gave a great deal of emphasis to Aristotle, even though he did synthesize Aquinas and Aristotle together in his psychognostic empirical psychology. But we have a great first talk. This is just talk number 1, part 1. We're going to be getting into a lot more of the specific detail as we go.